The bell above the door of Lena's Daily Crumb chimed with the same frantic urgency it always did when the wind whipped down the Chicago Avenue, but the silence that followed the sound was heavy, almost suffocating. Lena wiped her flour-dusted hands on her red apron, her heart performing a traitorous double beat against her ribs as she looked up. It was him. It was always him at this hour, precisely 10 minutes before closing, when the winter light had faded into a bruised purple over the skyline and the bakery felt like a warm, yeasty sanctuary against the cold. Dae-hyun stood in the doorway, a figure cut from midnight and steel, his charcoal wool coat tailored to an intimidating perfection that made the cozy, cluttered shop feel suddenly small and shabby. He was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at, sharp cheekbones, eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, and a mouth that was perpetually set in a grim, flat line. Lena had spent the last 6 months memorizing the way he ordered. Always a plain baguette, always black coffee, never a smile, and in the quiet spaces of her own lonely evenings, she had let herself imagine that his consistency meant something other than habit. She adjusted her white shirt, conscious of the smudge of dough near her collarbone, and moved to the counter, forcing a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. He approached the glass display, his gaze sweeping over the remaining pastries with a detached, clinical efficiency that chilled her. He was a man who looked at the world as a series of assets and liabilities, and Lena terrified herself with the knowledge that she wanted to be an asset he decided to keep. "The usual, Mr. Park?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat. The movement was fluid, practiced, the motion of a man who carried a weapon, though what he withdrew was a thick, white envelope. He placed it on the counter. The sound of the paper hitting the glass was sharper than a gunshot in the quiet room. He slid it toward her, his dark eyes finally locking onto hers. They were devoid of warmth, yet burning with a desperate, intense necessity. "Open it," he commanded, his voice a low baritone that vibrated through the wood of the counter and settled deep in her chest. Lena hesitated, her fingers hovering over the envelope. She opened the flap. Inside, crisp bills were stacked tightly, hundreds. It was $2,000. Confusion warred with a sudden, sinking humiliation. "I don't understand," she whispered. Dae-hyun leaned in, invading her personal space, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain washing over her. "Here's $2,000, he whispered, the words hitting her like a physical blow. "Just act like you care. Tonight. That is all I am buying." The request hung in the air, grotesque and transactional, shattering the fragile romantic narrative Lena had spun in her head for months. He wasn't asking for her. He was hiring a prop. She stared at the money, the corners of the bills sharp and clean, contrasting with the scarred wood of her counter. Her first instinct was to shove it back at him, to tell him that her dignity wasn't for sale, that she wasn't some escort he could rent to solve a temporary problem. But then she looked up at him again. For the first time, the mask of the untouchable crime lord slipped. Beneath the stoicism, she saw a frantic exhaustion, a cornered animal looking for an escape route. His hand, resting on the glass, was clenched so tight his knuckles were white. "My grandmother," he said, the admission seemingly dragged out of him. "She is dying. She believes I am settled. She demands to meet the woman who has softened my heart before she passes. Tonight is her 85th birthday gala." Lena felt the anger drain out of her, replaced by a dull ache of disappointment mixed with an unwanted surge of empathy. He didn't want her. He needed a body to fill a role. "You want me to lie to a dying woman?" Lena asked, her voice thick with emotion. "I want you to give an old woman peace," Dae-hyun corrected, his tone sharpening. "And I am paying you for your time." "This is business," he said, the word business like a shield, protecting himself from the reality of what he was asking. Lena looked around her bakery. The oven needed repairs. The rent had gone up again. Her mother's medical bills were sitting in a stack on her desk in the back office, unopened because she was too afraid to see the total. $2,000 could buy her breathing room. It could buy her mother's medication. But looking at Dae-hyun, she knew she wasn't accepting because of the money. She was accepting because, God help her. She didn't have to act. She already cared. That was the tragedy of it. I finish closing in 10 minutes, she said softly, taking the envelope and sliding it under the counter, feeling the weight of the lie settling on her shoulders. I don't have anything to wear for gala, Dae-hyun. It was the first time she had used his first name. He blinked, the sound of his name on her tongue seeming to startle him. He pulled a second item from his pocket, a black velvet box, and placed it where the money had been. There is a dress and a stylist waiting in the car outside. I prepared for the possibility of your acceptance, of course he had. He was a strategist. He didn't leave things to chance. 10 minutes, he repeated, then turned and walked toward the door, not looking back, leaving Lena alone with the smell of yeast, the stack of cash, and the breaking of her own heart. The car was a sleek, armored beast that glided through the Chicago streets with a silence that felt unnatural. Inside, the leather was soft as butter, and the temperature was perfectly controlled, a stark contrast to the biting wind outside. Lena sat in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap, trying not to touch anything, trying to shrink herself into the corner. She was wearing the dress he had provided, a stunning, floor-length gown of midnight blue silk that hugged her curves and left one shoulder bare. It was elegant, tasteful, and undoubtedly cost more than her entire bakery. Her hair, usually tied back in a messy bun, had been swept up by the stylist into a sophisticated chignon, exposing the line of her neck. She felt beautiful, but she also felt like an imposter, a doll dressed up for a playdate. Dae-hyun sat on the other side of the seat, typing furiously on his phone. He hadn't looked at her since she got in. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it felt like an ocean. "We need to get this story straight," he said without looking up, his thumbs flying across the screen. "We met 6 months ago. You came to the bakery, my bakery, because you like the bread. We started talking. I pursued you. You were hesitant because of my reputation. But you saw the good in me." He finally looked up, his dark eyes scanning her face, assessing the product he had bought. "Can you remember that?" Lena felt a flash of irritation. "It's not hard to remember, seeing as it's half true," she murmured. He paused, his phone lowering slightly. "Which half?" he asked, his voice guarded. "You did come to the bakery," she said, meeting his gaze. "And I was hesitant." She left out the part about seeing the good in him. She wasn't going to give him that satisfaction, not when he was treating this like a merger acquisition. He studied her for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Good. Keep it simple. Don't volunteer information. My family, they are wolves. If they sense weakness, they will tear you apart. Especially Sumin." Lena frowned. "Who is Sumin?" Dae-hyun's jaw tightened. "Someone who thinks she should be sitting where you are. Just stay close to me. And if anyone asks about your background, you own a boutique artisan bakery. Leave out the part about struggling to pay rent." Lena bristled. "I'm not ashamed of my work, Dae-hyun," he sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "I didn't say you were. But in my world, struggle is not seen as noble. It is seen as a failure." The car slowed to a halt. Through the tinted windows, Lena saw the entrance to a massive hotel, flanked by security guards and paparazzi. Panic flared in her chest. "Ready?" he asked. He didn't wait for an answer. He opened the door, the noise of the city rushing in, and extended his hand. Lena looked at his open palm. This was the deal. She took a deep breath, grabbed his hand, and let him pull her into the light. The ballroom was a cavern of crystal and gold, filled with the murmur of hundreds of people who spoke in hushed, expensive tones. The air smelled of lilies and money. Lena gripped Dae-hyun's arm, her fingers digging into the wool of his tuxedo jacket. She was grateful for the physical anchor, even if he felt as tense as a coiled wire beneath her touch. Every head seemed to turn as they entered. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a wind moving through wheat. Lena kept her head high, channeling every ounce of dignity she possessed. She refused to let them see her sweat. "Don't look at the floor," Dae-hyun murmured, his lips barely moving. "Look at them. Make them look away first." It was a lesson in power, one she realized he had been practicing his whole life. They moved through the crowd, Daehyun nodding curtly to men who looked like they killed people for a living and women who looked like they'd never touched a carb in their lives. Suddenly, a woman detached herself from a group near the bar and glided toward them. She was stunning, wearing a dress of crimson red that looked like spilled blood. Daehyun, she purred, stopping directly in their path. Her eyes flicked to Lena, scanning her from head to toe with a look of amused disdain. And who is this? I didn't think you brought casual company to Halmoni's birthday. This had to be Sumin. The jealousy radiating off her was palpable, sharp and toxic. Lena felt Daehyun stiffen. This is Lena, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous octave. My partner Sumin laughed, a brittle, tinkling sound. Partner? Oh, darling, please. She looks like she's terrified she's going to break the china. What does she do? Manicure? Secretary. Lena felt the insult land, but before she could respond, Daehyun stepped forward, shielding her slightly. She owns her own business, he said coldly. And she has more integrity in her little finger than you have in your entire trust fund. Sumin moved. The defense was unexpected. Lena looked up at him in surprise. He hadn't just defended her cover. He had defended her. Sumin's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. We'll see what Halmoni thinks, she hissed, stepping aside. Daehyun guided Lena forward, his hand sliding from her arm to the small of her back, a touch that felt searingly intimate. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me, he replied roughly, looking straight ahead. I'm protecting my investment, but his hand lingered on her back, the warmth of his palm seeping through the silk, telling a different story. They reached the head table, where an elderly woman sat on a throne-like chair. She was tiny, frail, wrapped in a traditional hanbok of pale lavender, but her eyes were sharp as obsidian. This was the matriarch, the woman who held the strings of a criminal empire. Daehyun bowed deeply, a gesture of respect Lena had never seen him perform. Halmoni, he said softly. Happy birthday. The old woman didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on Lena. It was a dissection. She was looking for the cracks, the lies. So, the grandmother said, her voice raspy but clear. This is the one who keeps you from your duties. It wasn't a question. Lena felt her throat go dry. She stepped forward, bowing her head slightly as she had seen Daehyun do. It is an honor to meet you, Madam Park, Lena said, her voice steady. I am Lena. The old woman gestured for her to come closer. Lena obliged, kneeling slightly, so she was at eye level. He pays you, the grandmother asked in Korean. Daehyun flinched. Lena froze. She didn't speak Korean, but the tone was accusatory. Daehyun started to interject, Halmoni, but the old woman silenced him with a raised hand. She switched to English, her accent thick. Why are you here? Money? Power? He is a dangerous man. A cold man. Lena looked at the grandmother, then back at Daehyun. He looked terrified. Not for himself, but that the ruse was over. Lena looked back at the old woman and spoke the truth, forgetting the script, forgetting the $2,000. He is cold, Lena agreed softly. But the bread he buys. He always buys the plain loaf because he says the seeds get stuck in his teeth, but I know it's because he brings the other half to the stray cat behind my shop. I've seen him. Daehyun's eyes widened. He didn't know she had seen that. He is cold, Lena continued, because he thinks he has to be to protect you. I am here because no one should have to be that cold alone. The table went silent. The grandmother stared at Lena for a long, agonizing minute. Then, the corners of her mouth twitched upwards. She reached out a withered hand and cupped Lena's cheek. He feeds the cat, she chuckled dryly. He hates cats. She looked at Daehyun. She sees you, grandson. That is rare. Keep her. The tension in the air snapped. Daehyun let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. He reached down and helped Lena up, his hand gripping hers tightly. As they walked away toward the dance floor, he leaned close to her ear. I do hate cats, he whispered, a note of wonder in his voice. I didn't know you watched me leave. Lena blushed, looking away. There's a lot you don't know about me, Daehyun. Clearly, he murmured. He pulled her into a dance position, his other hand finding her waist. The music swelled, a slow, mournful waltz. For a moment, the transaction was forgotten. They were just a man and a woman, moving in time, surrounded by enemies, holding onto each other for dear life. The dance was a blur of motion and sensory overload. Lena was hyper-aware of every inch of contact between them, his chest against hers, his thigh brushing hers as they turned. She realized with a jolt that this was the closest she had ever been to a man, emotionally and physically, and it was all technically a lie. Yet, the way he held her wasn't performative. It was possessive. He held her as if he was afraid she would evaporate if he let go. "You did well," he said, his voice low and rumbling against her ear. "Better than well. Halmoni, she never likes anyone." Lena looked up at him. "I didn't lie to her," she said simply. "I told her what I see." Dae-hyun's expression softened, the hard lines around his eyes smoothing out. "And what do you see right now?" he asked. The question was loaded, dangerous. Lena opened her mouth to answer, to maybe tell him the truth about the crush, the longing, the way her day started only when he walked through her door. But before she could speak, a commotion erupted near the entrance. The music faltered. A group of men had entered, not guests, wearing suits that were too cheap and expressions that were too aggressive. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, from celebration to threat. Dae-hyun stopped dancing. His body transformed against hers, turning from a partner into a shield. He pushed her behind him, his hand going instinctively to the inside of his jacket. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice ice-cold again. "Do not move." Lena peered around his shoulder. The men were shouting something in Korean. Security was rushing forward. It was a rival faction, a display of disrespect on the grandmother's birthday. A glass shattered. People screamed. In the chaos, a waiter was shoved, and a tray of drinks went flying. Red wine splashed across Dae-hyun's pristine white shirt, soaking the front. He didn't flinch, his eyes locked on the threat, but the stain looked like a gaping wound. Lena didn't think. She didn't cower in fear. She reached into her clutch, pulled out a handkerchief, and stepped in front of him, dabbing at the stain, placing herself between him and the room. "You're ruined," she said, her voice shaking but loud enough for him to hear. She was fussing over his shirt while men with guns were shouting. It was insane. It was domestic. Dae-hyun grabbed her wrists, stopping her hands. He looked down at her, bewildered. "Lena, they are armed." "Get back, I don't care," she snapped, looking him in the eye. "Let them look at me. If they look at me, they aren't looking at your grandmother." It was a distraction tactic. She was making herself a target to de-escalate the insult to his family. Dae-hyun stared at her, shock replacing the aggression in his eyes. In that moment, surrounded by danger, the $2,000 in her pocket felt like ashes. She wasn't acting. She was protecting him. And for the first time, Dae-hyun looked at her not as a baker or a fake fiancé, but as the only real thing in his entire world. The drive back to the bakery was a blur of neon lights and suffocating silence, the kind of quiet that screams louder than any shout. Dae-hyun drove this time, his knuckles white against the leather steering wheel, the partition between them and the driver raised for absolute privacy. Lena sat in the passenger seat, her hands trembling in her lap, the adrenaline from the gala slowly leaching out of her system and leaving behind a cold, shaky exhaustion. Every time she glanced at him, his jaw was set so hard she thought a tooth might crack. He wasn't just angry, he was furious, a controlled burn of rage that filled the small cabin of the luxury car. When he finally curbed the vehicle in front of Lena's Daily Crumb, the engine cut with a finality that made her jump. He didn't wait for her to open her door. He was out and around the hood in seconds, yanking her door open and offering a hand that was firm, demanding, and brooked no argument. He marched her to the bakery door, shielding her body with his own as if the shadows of the street were armed gunmen. She fumbled with her keys, her fingers slipping on the metal, until he gently took them from her, unlocked the door, and pushed her inside, locking it instantly behind them. The familiar scent of yeast and cinnamon usually calmed her, but tonight it felt like a cage. Dae-hyun spun around, pacing the small customer area, his tuxedo jacket discarded on a table, his tie undone. He looked wild, unlike the composed statue she knew. "What were you thinking?" he finally exploded, his voice echoing off the tile walls. "Stepping in front of me? Making yourself a target?" Lena leaned against the display case, her legs feeling like water. "They were humiliating you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I didn't think." "Exactly," he roared, slamming a hand against the counter, far away from her but violent enough to make the display glass rattle. "You didn't think. You are a civilian, Lena. You bake bread. You do not stand between a muted war and its target." He walked toward her, stopping inches away, his breathing heavy. "Do you have any idea what they could have done to you? Do you think your $2,000 covers a bullet wound?" The mention of the money stung, a sharp reminder of the transaction that started the night. Lena straightened, her own anger flaring to meet his. "Stop talking about the money," she snapped. "I didn't do it for the money. I did it because you looked alone. Because for a second, you weren't the scary mob boss. You were just a guy with wine on his shirt and a room full of people happy to see him bleed." Dae-hyun froze, his eyes searching hers, the fury slowly draining away to reveal a raw, terrified vulnerability. "I am not used to being protected," he whispered hoarsely. "It is terrifying." The silence that followed his admission was different, heavier, charged with an electricity that made the air feel thin. The bakery was dark, save for the streetlights filtering through the blinds, casting stripes of amber shadow across Dae-hyun's face. He looked exhausted, the weight of his lineage and his choices pressing down on his shoulders. Lena stepped forward, crossing the invisible line he always kept between them. She reached out, her hand hovering for a second before she placed it gently on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it hammering, a frantic rhythm that betrayed his calm exterior. "You don't have to be terrified here," she said softly. "The door is locked. The world is outside." Dae-hyun looked down at her hand, then up at her eyes, his expression crumbling. He covered her hand with his own, his fingers rough and warm. "You were supposed to be a prop," he murmured, his voice sounding wrecked. "You were supposed to be a simple solution to a nagging problem. You were not supposed to be." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "Not supposed to be what?" Lena challenged, stepping closer, until the tips of her shoes touched his. The scent of him, rain, sandalwood, and the metallic tang of fear, was overwhelming. Dae-hyun let out a ragged sigh, a sound of surrender. "Real," he admitted. "You were not supposed to be real." The word hung between them, stripping away the pretenses of the evening. The fake engagement, the contract, the money, it all dissolved. Dae-hyun's hand moved from her hand to her waist, pulling her in with a sudden, desperate gravity. Lena gasped, her hands finding purchase on his shoulders. When he kissed her, it wasn't tentative. It was a collision. It was months of silent longing, of stolen glances over baguettes and coffee, of keep the change and have a nice day, exploding into contact. His mouth was hot and demanding, tasting of wine and desperation. Lena melted into him, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. He groaned low in his throat, lifting her easily and setting her on the counter, stepping between her knees to get closer. For a moment, there was no Mafia, no danger, no dying grandmother. There was only this, the heat of his skin, the strength of his arms, and the undeniable truth that the transaction had been a lie from the very beginning. The morning light that filtered into the back office of the bakery was cruel and gray, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Lena woke up on the small, worn sofa she kept for long overnight shifts, a blanket tucked carefully around her shoulders. For a disorienting moment, she felt warm, safe. Then the memory of the previous night rushed back. The gala, the argument, the kiss that had unraveled her. She sat up quickly, the blanket falling away. The bakery was silent. Too silent. She stood up, her silk dress from the night before wrinkled, her feet bare on the cold floor, and walked into the main shop area. It was empty. The front door was locked. On the counter, right where he had lifted her, sat the white envelope. The $2,000. Beside it was a note written on a napkin in sharp, angular handwriting. The contract is fulfilled. Thank you for your services. Do not look for me. It is safer this way. Lena stared at the note, her chest hollowing out. He had left. He had paid her and left. The cold practicality of it felt like a slap in the face. He was rewriting what happened, forcing it back into the box of a business transaction because he was too much of a coward to face the reality of his feelings. Or, a small voice whispered, he was doing it to protect her. But it didn't feel like protection. It felt like abandonment. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and angry. She grabbed the envelope, her grip tightening until the paper crinkled. He thought he could buy her silence? He thought he could buy her heart and then return it with a receipt? She looked around her shop, the place where she had built her life, the place he had invaded. He had come in here, disrupted her peace, made her fall in love with him, and then tried to pay her off like she was just another employee. No, she whispered to the empty room. Absolutely not. She wasn't going to let him decide how this story ended. She wasn't a prop. She wasn't a liability. She was Lena, and she made the best bread in Chicago, and she loved a stubborn, idiotic criminal who thought loneliness was a virtue. She marched to the back, grabbed her jeans and a sweater, and changed with furious efficiency. She wasn't keeping the money, and she certainly wasn't keeping the silence. It took Lena 2 days to work up the courage, and 3 hours to find the address. It wasn't listed, obviously, but the grandmother had mentioned the Park Holdings Tower downtown during the gala, and a little internet sleuthing had done the rest. The building was a monolith of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the sky, cold and imposing. Lena walked into the lobby wearing her red apron over her coat, a deliberate choice. She wasn't here to play his game. She was here as herself. She carried a brown paper bag in one hand and the white envelope in the other. The security guard at the front desk looked at her with skepticism. "I'm here to see Dae-hyun Park," she said, her voice steady. "I don't have an appointment. Tell him it's the baker. Tell him I have a refund." The guard blinked, likely confused by the juxtaposition of her attire and her demand, but he made the call. Minutes later, she was being escorted into a private elevator that shot upward with stomach-churning speed. When the doors opened, she stepped into an office that looked more like a museum than a workspace. Minimalist furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and silence. Dae-hyun was standing by the window, his back to her. He didn't turn around when she entered. "I told you not to look for me," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the passion from 2 nights ago. "I'm not very good at following orders," Lena replied, walking up to his massive glass desk and slamming the envelope down on it. The sound echoed. "You forgot your change." Dae-hyun finally turned. He looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his posture was rigid. He looked at the envelope, then at her. "Keep it," he said wearily. "You earned it. You saved face for my family. I didn't do it for the money." Lena shouted, the frustration finally boiling over. "Stop trying to cheapen it. You kissed me, Dae-hyun. You held me. Was that in the contract? Was that billable hours?" Dae-hyun flinched. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away, his hands clenched at his sides. "It was a mistake," he said, though his eyes betrayed him. "I am a dangerous man, Lena. My world. It is not for you. I bring only danger. I cannot have attachments." "I'm not an attachment," she said, stepping into his space, forcing him to look at her. "I'm a choice. You don't get to decide for me what's too dangerous. I saw you. I saw the man who feeds the cat. I saw the man who loves his grandmother. I love that man. And you don't get to pay me to stop loving him." Dae-hyun stared at her, stunned into silence. Her words hung in the air, defiant and brave. He looked at the envelope on the desk, then at the brown paper bag in her hand. "What is that?" he asked softly, diverting. Lena huffed, opening the bag. She pulled out a fresh, warm baguette. "It's bread," she said, tearing a piece off. "And it has seeds in it." She held the piece out to him. "You always order the plain one because you think you have to be perfect, sleek, uncomplicated. You think the seeds are messy. But the seeds are the best part, Dae-hyun. They give it flavor. They make it real." She took a step closer, the bread in her hand and offering a challenge. I'm not afraid of the mess. I'm not afraid of the seeds. Stop pretending you just want the plain loaf. Dae-hyun looked at the bread, then at her face, her fierce, beautiful, determined face. The walls he had built around himself, brick by brick over a lifetime of violence and expectation, began to crumble. He realized then that he hadn't been protecting her. He had been protecting himself from the terrifying possibility of being loved for who he actually was. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out. He didn't take the bread. He took her hand, the one holding the offering, and brought it to his mouth. He took a bite, seeds and all, his eyes never leaving hers. He chewed, swallowed, and for the first time in 6 months, a genuine, unguarded smile broke across his face. It is better, he admitted softly. With the seeds, Lena let out a watery laugh, the tension breaking. I told you. Dae-hyun pulled her into his arms, burying his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of yeast and vanilla that he had missed more than he could bear. I am keeping the money, though, he murmured against her skin. Lena pulled back, frowning. What? No, I don't want. I am keeping it, he interrupted, to invest in a bakery. I hear the owner needs a new oven. And, perhaps, a partner. He wasn't talking about business anymore. Lena smiled, wrapping her arms around his neck. I'm a tough boss, she warned. I demand high standards. I will do my best, Dae-hyun promised, leaning in to kiss her, a slow, deliberate seal on a new kind of deal, one with no contracts, no expiration date, and absolutely no acting required.